All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Others who join will just join as we're in progress. So good afternoon and welcome. I'm Bonita Juliet, and I'm hosting this webinar today. Feel free throughout the webinar to go ahead and use the Q&A feature. It's at the bottom of your screen. There's a little Q&A there, and if you pull that up, you should be able to type in any questions that you have. And then the panelists, I'll forward those to the panelists and they will answer. So we'll use about 25 to 30 minutes of the time at the beginning here to hear from Ben Lacy and Dave Akers, our panelists, both experts in their respective fields. They'll take about 30 minutes to do the presentation, then we'll move into the Q&A. So please submit your questions throughout. Don't be shy, because obviously they're the experts. Those of us who are here to learn today are not. So all questions are available. So again, welcome to COVID-19 in Pennsylvania, maintaining business continuity as restrictions change. Go ahead, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonita. My name is Ben Lacy, and joining me today is Dave Akers. A little bit about myself. I've been with Concurrent Technologies Corporation, a Johnstown, Pennsylvania-based company for about 7 years since retiring from the military. While in military service, most of my career was focused around aviation safety and operations. So talking about business continuity, planning processes, and how to mitigate risk in support of your operations is something that's a little near and dear to my heart. Joining me is Dave Akers, so I'd like to let Dave go ahead and introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Akers. I've been working for Concurrent Technologies for coming up on 11 and a half years now, largely involved with supporting various DoD sites. I have the education side, as I just recently finished my master's in safety, security, and emergency management with a specific focus in emergency management. I'm a certified safety professional and also have my occupational safety and health technologist certifications from BCSP, the Board of Certified Safety Professionals. I don't have nearly the cool sounding background that Ben does, but this is certainly an area that's very near and dear to my heart. And as I'm also a parent, watching this sort of thing, the changes going on right now, is adding a lot of extra personal interest for how organizations should need to better plan for continuity operations.
Super, thanks so much, Dave. And I'll be starting today's discussion off with the first few slides, and then Dave would take us home for that. So without further ado, going to the first slide here, jumping right into it, highlights the planning process. And again, this is business continuity in a COVID environment. So as you see the planning process, it very closely aligns with how the Federal Emergency Management Agency uses in terms of their planning process in response of disasters here in the United States. We're going to go through each of these subtopics or sub-bullets in a little more detail, but just highlighting this, you'll see 6 bullets here. It talks about creating the team. The second one will be evaluating and understanding the issues. The third one is determining the goals and objectives. The fourth one was develop the plan. The fifth one is formalize the plan and document it. And then the last piece is implement and evaluate. Before we go on, just a quick disclaimer. Any of the information that we share with you today, we recognize that it may be perhaps a little dated, and I ask that anybody that is listening in on the webinar to always consider following the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's guidance as it relates to COVID. The governor just put out some recent guidance as late as August 6th last week in terms of identifying and describing a little more of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's process as we go forward. And again, highlighting the 3 different phases, those being red, yellow, and green. There's several sites that are available that highlight also which phases each county in Western Pennsylvania currently is in. Most counties, if you look at the most recent map, show most of Western Pennsylvania is still in a yellow stage. We have seen several counties now transition to green, but we also do have some counties that do remain red. So always consider the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or the state's guidance, as well as the guidance that's set forth by CDC as it relates to COVID and the COVID environment. So The first step that we talked about as we talk about the planning process was creating a team. And again, important aspect of this is to identify the core members that are going to be on your team. It may vary based on the size of business. So as we talk perhaps about a small or medium-sized business, you may find that your core staff or your core team is relatively small. Whereas if we're a large corporation or maybe even perhaps a multinational corporation that is based in Western Pennsylvania, you'll find that maybe you have the resources such as marketing, or maybe you have your own safety staff, which includes an industrial hygienist. Therefore, your team composition may differ obviously based on the size of your organization or your business. We also understand that several businesses or organizations, their team composition will obviously be, dictated based on the type of business they are. So, for instance, if we're in the education field, I'm married to an educator, that, those folks that are on a core team for a school district obviously would be a little different than the members that we'd see on a core team for a hospital. So something just to keep in mind is we're putting our team together as we move forward. The next bullet on here you'll see include representation from all functional areas. Sometimes that is not feasible based on the schedules of your team. So when possible, try to create a meeting rhythm or a meeting schedule that allows for as much representation and participation from the functional areas that are involved in your core team. It goes without saying that management needs to demonstrate the support. So obviously when kicking off your team's plans as we prepare for business continuity during recovery operations specifically, you want that senior management team to be involved in this process, especially as we kick it off. The last bullet on here, some organizations have some very deep feelings and values as it relates to how to respond, and work in a COVID environment. So sometimes it may be beneficial to consider someone, to perhaps take the role as an outside facilitator. We have seen in some businesses that the HR, so perhaps the VP or senior director of HR will run, our COVID response. We've seen other organizations that have dedicated safety professionals, or even a vice president of operations. We've seen a variety of folks that have helped facilitate the actions and efforts of the team. Moving on to slide 4 here. Evaluate and understand the issues. There are several things, obviously, we need to consider, and it's an ever-changing environment. When we talk about the planning process, when we first introduce those concepts, understand that, it's always evolutionary, and we could perhaps sometimes execute the planning process at one point and then come back in at a different step based on what may happen. Nationally, we've seen several areas throughout the country that they thought they were perhaps on the road to recovery and then only to be stricken perhaps by, a quote unquote second wave. Or we've seen some areas throughout the country where it was thought perhaps that young folks are not as susceptible to COVID. Now all of a sudden we're finding out that based on recent testing that there are perhaps a large number of young people that can contract the virus. So evaluating and understanding the issues is very important to this planning process. We see 3 primary bullets on here: identifying the threats and hazards. We're going to go and show some risk charts or risk matrices here in a few moments, but it's important to obviously identify the vulnerabilities for our organization, our business. The vulnerabilities may vary. If we're in production or in manufacturing, our vulnerabilities may be very much susceptible to supply chain actions. So, while some of us operate very lean, just-in-time supply theory may be a little difficult, to accomplish in a COVID environment. Perhaps some other vulnerabilities would be if we're heavily dependent perhaps on a organization outside the state that supports our business that is in much worse, dire straits than what we see here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that may impact our own organic business operations. We talked about at the beginning here about, reputable sources for information continue to be the Commonwealth of the State of Pennsylvania, website. The governor's staff pushes out a myriad of updated information quite frequently and rather regularly. The CDC, obviously one of the best resources as it relates to reputable, up-to-date resources that talk and discuss COVID, as well as FEMA and some others. So, we talked about identifying the threats and hazards, and we know those vary based on business or based on activity, but we also need to assess the risk. So what is the impact to our business? We talked a little bit about the logistics or perhaps the shipping aspects if we're in manufacturing, but, for instance, assessing the risk for us in the educational area, schools. Some districts are really struggling with how do we protect our students and our teachers and staff? Do we go to a mix of perhaps distance or virtual learning? Do we give families, the option of virtual learning or in-school learning? So there's a variety of, methods that we can use to assess the risk, and we're going to show a chart here in a couple of slides. But, we see in here supply chain shortcomings. And, when we talk about risk, COVID has been a game changer for this nation as well as the world. We've also seen some businesses that have, perhaps embraced the change. So, embrace the change or be changed. So some businesses and some activities have seen or found new opportunities as a result of this. While we see some very, very disheartening statistics as it relates to the restaurant industry throughout the United States, with numbers, even on the more conservative standpoint of perhaps 30% of restaurants may close and not reopen as a result of COVID. We've seen some restaurants or some activities that have gone to takeout, and they've done very successful. So, while COVID has created some significant challenges for all facets, of the American public, in the American economy, it all has created some new opportunities for some organizations. And the last bullet here, COVID-19, obviously it's a pandemic, it's an outbreak. We all see on the nightly news, the devastation it's created, throughout the world as well as our nation, not just economically, but, the consequences they can have on public health. There are ever-changing guidelines as it relates to this, but, the best course of action continues to be wearing a face covering, washing hands frequently, and social distancing, and following the guidance from the CDC as well as the state. There are several examples of COVID-specific risk assessments that are available through an internet search, just using your browser. I'm just going to go through two very quickly here before we pass it off to Dave. But you'll see, like many risk matrices, one axis has the hazard severity and the other one has the likelihood of occurrence. So, how bad can it hurt me is illustrated on the left-hand side of this matrix. And, the likelihood that it could happen, you see that, across the top or the horizontal axis. So, the risk matrices are easy to use, and we also understand for some, I may find a specific hazard to perhaps be moderate, while someone else may consider that to be serious. So for some folks, where you enter this table, whether it's the hazard severity or the likelihood of occurrence could vary, but you'll generally end up in the same area. If you're working as a team, as we discussed at the beginning, it's a very good idea to perhaps socialize the risk matrix as it involves, different risks for the organization, and have the whole team look at it, because in some cases, as you see illustrated in this particular risk matrix, the care or the caution are two very different, issues. So while they're both minor harm probable, one says that, serious harm is very unlikely to occur, the other one major harm. So just consider that when we're analyzing risk to the organization and trying to analyze that, in a manner that helps us go in one direction or another, that perhaps we use the team to evaluate the risk. And again, a very common practice is using a matrix as shown on this slide. The next slide, a little bit of a deviation from a typical risk matrix, but I'm just showing this. This is published by the City of Austin, Texas's Austin Public Health Department. What they elected to do is, rather than perhaps the traditional risk matrix with, the severity and the likelihood of occurrence, they broke it down by the different stages of public health as it relates to COVID. So you'll see stage 5 on the bottom of this risk-based guideline is, the most dire or the most restrictive stage. And as the organization or as an organization and as restrictions ease in the state, you can move up to different stages, and you see columns that represent, whether it's hygiene, what we do with higher risk individuals versus low risk individuals, and whether or not the workplaces, remain open, or if they do open, to what level they open to the public, based on perhaps a percentage. So again, these are two different types of risk-based matrix that can be used by organizations. There's a variety of them available just by doing a simple search on an internet browser, as well as using both state and federal websites as a means to help with your planning, not just as we work our way through the COVID restrictions that have impacted so many businesses throughout the United States, but ultimately, many of us should be looking beyond just the restrictions that we currently operate under, but perhaps looking at the recovery aspect. So, when you look at the Governor Wolf's website or his webpage, it's broken in really the 3 phases for, the plan for Pennsylvania. The first was relief. The second is reopening, which we're in now. And then the last phase being recovery. So, many businesses should be looking forward to leaving reopening and getting to the recovery aspect as it relates to COVID-19. So at this point, slide 7, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Dave, and Dave's going to take us through the rest of the presentation. So Dave?
Thank you very much, Ben. So we're going to start with, after we've talked about, determined our risk, we figured out kind of what's going on, we've got a team together, then we got to start deciding what are our goals for getting through, in this case, COVID-19, although this really kind of applies to any kind of disaster or emergency situation. First thing you got to decide is what's important. What are your real priorities? Obviously we got some things that are going to be commonalities with priorities. You want your employees to be safe, because without your employees, you can't do anything. You need various business operations to operate. You have various maybe core pieces of business that really, we got to keep this piece going at least 90%. But there may be another part of your business, for whatever reason, you don't need quite that level necessarily fully at all times to resource well enough to prioritize it. But then you take those priorities, what's most important to you, and set our goals. Goals are what do we want to do? So we'll for this conversation, we'll keep it, our goal is to keep employees safe. Perfect, good goal. So then we got to develop our objectives to support the goals. That gets into the how-to. How are we going to keep our employees safe? Well, follow the guidance. As has been given, is kind of your best first place to start, but then you got to figure out how that looks. And we'll talk about how it looks in a minute. But to carry this through just a little bit, keep our employees safe. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to telework as much as feasible. If we have to be in a physical structure, we're going to check everyone's temperature before they come in. Masks will be required. We'll do social distancing. We'll put up various plexiglass things. And whatever other specific objectives you have in order to keep your employees safe. And that's what's all being driven from your priorities down through your goals, and then your objectives are supporting your goals. In a manner to kind of keep goals lined up, you see the SMART graphic there: specific, measurable, agreed, realistic, and time-bound. So you need to keep kind of those things in mind, because having real vague goals doesn't help you plan around a vague goal. You need something a little bit more specific. But we'll talk about a little bit in the next slide how that looks, how these kind of start to play into developing a plan. All right, so you have your set of priorities, and you have your goals, and you have objectives. From there, you need to start actually developing a plan. You start that by you start talking about different scenarios. Within the COVID scenario, we have the different phases. So what do things look like if we're in a red phase? How do we operate our business? What can we do? We look at our operational actions, which is our operational actions. What do we do? Who's doing it? And what does it take? So in red, that's the most restrictive. So you can do very little. Very little is allowed. And what is allowed is limited. So you have to figure out, what are you doing? You have to identify who's doing it, which are most necessarily essential positions or employees, maybe people who have to come into the physical building. What people are not essential in the building, so we can have them, again, on the telework side, still doing great work, but not necessarily right there. And here's the big piece, and this is the one where the pre-planning helps. What does it take? What does it take to, for example, move 75% of your workforce into a telework position? I'm not an IT guy, I can't fully answer that, which is why we would be doing this in a multidisciplinary team. But it's obviously going to take, people are going to have internet, and they're going to have a certain ability with computers or a certain availability of laptops in order to do their work. So from a concrete perspective, these are the things you have to look at. What do we really need to do to keep our core business functions going, which is part of our priorities, which is being in our goals. And then again, we need to look at our needed resources. What is it going to really take? How much can we afford, and what can we afford? And where can we get help? Because suddenly going from a in the office with maybe even desktop computers to a telework situation where people really going to need laptops is going to be a huge resource sink, and it may or may not even be possible. Now, granted, there are various and sundry federal side things that can help with financing and stuff and through the COVID, but that's not necessarily something you can count on, because that's driven by who's doing what program at any given time and what money may actually be available to you. But all this is getting really, starting to get concrete. And when you develop your scenarios, you need to also think about the what next and what ifs. For example, and we're talking about Pennsylvania, yesterday at noon, the governor's office put out new guidance for schools and school districts. So yesterday afternoon, all the parents in this school district I live in got emails that said, hey, the rules are changed. We had a plan, and that plan's out the window, and we don't have our next plan yet. And that's kind of a part where they fell down. They had one plan and stopped there. You need to continue to plan and evaluate for what happens as the scenario changes. Like I said, in Pennsylvania, we have all the different phases we go through and what's allowed and not allowed in each phase. So you have to figure out what things look like for you in each phase and what you need to do. And you can't assume it's going to stay static. Things are going to bounce back and forth. Would you go to the next slide, please, there, Ben? Okay, so once we start to get all our plans and our different permutations of plans and scenarios together, we need to write it out. It needs to be documented. That makes it available to everyone. Anyone can look at it. This is a big piece. You want to communicate what your plan is, because you want your employees to feel confident in the situation, that your company is handling things well, and they need to be able to read that in nice, simple, plain language. It doesn't need to be some bizarre legalese document. Got to provide enough detail in the plan to be actionable, so people know what it is they're supposed to be doing and what they should expect to have happen, for example, when they come into the office. Should be easy to navigate. Again, the simpler this document can be and still meet the criteria, the better. And you got to mark it internally and externally. The internal part, I think, is kind of obvious. Employees and the people that work there all need to know what's going on. Externally, it's meaningful because you don't operate alone in a vacuum. In some form or fashion, you have customers. In some form or fashion, you have someone in the supply chain. So you need to make sure that those people understand what's going on so that they know what they can expect from you, and conversely, what you can expect from them in terms of what the capabilities are going to be, so that you can make your plans. Having your perfect plan set up, and I use that term slightly facetiously, perfect, but having your plan set up, but you didn't talk to someone on your supply chain side to find out what they were doing and what you can expect from them, well, all of a sudden your plan doesn't work because they can't give you the stuff that you need to do your business because their business isn't working out right, or their plan's not right, or their plan simply includes, well, we're not doing that little thing anymore. We're not providing that service or whatever, of whatever type. Excuse me. Yeah, go to the next slide, because this kind of starts to wrap things up a little bit. Implementation maintenance. This is kind of the big piece. So we've written a plan based on our goals, based on our priorities, based on our goals. We got to train our employees. It sounds simple, but it's actually bizarrely overlooked. employees need to understand what they're supposed to do and know specifically. If your expectation is for employees to wear masks, for example, they should know how to wear a mask. Don't think I'm going on a limb here to guess that anyone who's been out in public sees people wearing masks in other than the right way. So we need to make sure our employees understand what that looks like. We then need to go ahead and start executing our plan and review the results. Is it working? Are things happening like they're supposed to do? Is the environment staying such that our plan is going to continue to work? Or is it going to be a situation where it's changed? Did we move to a different phase? Did school district, for example, I'll come back to that again. Right now, the school district my children attend don't know what school looks like in the fall, which means I, as an employee, don't know what I can do for my company. If they turn to 100% online school, that's going to change some of the ways I can do my work. And my company needs to know that. And I need to know from them how that looks. So you have to be able to adjust again to the changes. And some of these changes are going to be science driven. We're going to get different information. We're going to learn new things about COVID. And then we can, and that'll then be incorporated into general policies, plans, Governor Wolf's office announcements about what's going on in Pennsylvania, what you can and cannot do. And we need to look at that and adjust. And that's the other part with the plan. It continues to live. You can't take the plan, write it, say it's done, finish it, send it, print it, good, and never look back at it. You have to continue to evaluate these things. Because if you're not getting the results you want out of it, you have to be ready to change. And that's the point of the review. And it should be kind of a continuous and ongoing thing. And again, in this environment, especially as week to week things can change and do change, you need to be prepared to deal with that and make sure you're still going to get the results you want. I think that's the last slide for me. That's it. Thank you very much. I'm guessing hopefully we have questions. Oh, there are questions.
Yes. Someone is asking, how does having a plan help me get back to full capacity more quickly?
It helped. Okay, having a plan helps you. Yeah, you want? You're giving that to me, man? I figured. Okay, having the plan helps you get back to full capacity more quickly because you never fell as far.
Okay.
If you have a plan, which I know I'm not making a flippant answer. If you were ready for COVID, a pandemic of any kind, or any disaster, any emergency, doesn't matter. If you have a plan ahead of time of to how you're going to do it, and you've thought through all your scenarios and you've developed a plan, you're going to implement it quicker. You're going to implement it more efficiently. You're going to implement it faster. You hopefully will have tested the plan as best you could ahead of time so that you knew what worked and what didn't. So when the event, for example, a pandemic hit, it still hurts. A fire is going to hurt no matter what, but it doesn't hurt as bad. And if you don't fall as far, it's much faster and easier to get back to where you were, or at least, recover more quickly.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. Hey, Benita, I'd like to also add, there was an old saying when I was a junior military officer that no plan stays intact after first action. So in other words, we could have what we consider to be the best plan ever, but as soon as we came in contact with the enemy, the plan that we thought was the best ever is no longer valid. So, Dave touched on it, I think, real well when he said, this is a continuous process. So if we went through the planning process and we developed a plan and we had a roadmap for the future and we see that the situations have changed, that may impact our plan. I mean, we may have to change our plan. And I think Dave highlighted it pretty good with the school district example. What's it going to look like for my kids? Because that impacts how we as a family unit, continue to work, or, how we will support that effort. So.
Okay,
next
good
question.
So that kind of plays into the next question was, if we stay in reopen phase, which is where we are for most of us in Pennsylvania, for a long time, it still doesn't mean, just as Dave kind of noted, that it's still, my situation's still not stable. So in other words, my employer needs to make a plan that considers a lot of different situations, but still in that phase.
I wouldn't
Yeah,
say a lot of.
that's correct.
Well,
Go
I wouldn't say quite entirely different plans in cases, but think in terms more along of lines of thought in a flow chart and contingencies. What if this happens? Okay, what if all of a sudden we go, you have to be prepared, I guess, to move between plans and continue to develop them. So if you have a green phase plan, and it's working, great, don't mess with it. And then all of a sudden you have to be prepared to bounce back to your yellow plan because the numbers shot up or something else happened in your immediate area. So it's less a matter of having more plans, it's just one plan with multiple branches.
Okay.
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations have used, it's a pretty tried and proven process in terms of a decision tree. So we come to questions and, it's either a yes or no answer, and that determines which branch or which sequel I will follow. So, just revisiting the thought of, hey, maybe my plan should be somewhat structured like a decision tree, that I have milestones or I have, key parts where I have to ask the question, hey, do we do this, yes or no? And based on the yes or no determines which way I'm going to go, much like, Dave said with branches or sequels.
Good, thank you. In your experience, does the development of a plan like this frighten or concern employees when you first roll it out? How do you share the plan? You talked about having it available internally and externally, but how do you actually roll it out so that you're building confidence and not creating fear?
This is Ben. I like to maybe take that one. I think the best way to roll it out, is effective communication. And I think we talked about that last month during our webinar is, we're responding to a pandemic here. And, believe it or not, the corporate staff, the C-suite, they may not have all the answers, especially for everything. However, we may have some very talented employees or supervisors that have a good idea. So, I think as long as we keep the communication, the two-way communication flowing up from the employees as well as down from our management team, that's going to enable, the plan to be received well by all and going forward. So, empowering our employees in some shape, form, or fashion to be involved and be able to provide input as it relates to the plan, and disseminating that plan, throughout the organization through everybody, is an important piece so that everybody understands. Because, we put it in the sports analogy in terms of, hey, if I have a football team out on the field and the offense is out there and I call a play, but only 8 of the 11 players understand what that play is, and 3 of the most critical players being the center, the quarterback, and the wide receiver don't, I'm probably either going to mess up the snap or I'm going to have a receiver run the wrong route and the quarterback's going to get sacked. So, making sure that everybody on the team knows what the plan is and their role in being active in the plan is an important part. Dave, is there anything you want to add?
No, I do think that covers it. Basically, I mean, the other kind of way to look at that slightly is, yes, any emergency is frightening. I think it's automatically made more frightening by not having thought about it ahead of time and having a plan to deal with it. Because at least with a plan, even if it's not the perfect plan, you help eliminate some of the initial confusion, and confusion always causes stress, which leads to greater fears.
Okay, good point. The next question is, does it make sense to have a generic pandemic plan in case we encounter influenza or some other type of disease?
Absolutely. Having even a generic plan or an imperfect plan is better than no plan at all. And since these are living documents, as we talk about these plans, okay, so we had a generic pandemic plan, and now we have a very specific pandemic, and we've at this point learned a whole lot about how it all works. Well, then you modify the plan to encompass the specifics of the situation. Think of it, you can think of it almost like having a fire plan. You know, we have any kind of emergency evacuation plan. You can't make those plans specific generally to what happens if the fire's over here versus over there.
Mm-hmm.
No, you have a generalized plan, and then you execute the plan with the appropriate modification for the specific location of the fire or the specific type of pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Ben, did you have something to add to that?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think the CDC has illustrated firsthand that, you know, much of the planning that perhaps went into consideration for whether it be SARS, MERS, and H1N1 virus, some of those aspects of the plan were, I think, a very important foundation for what we've had with COVID, as well as some of those issues or some of the plans that we had developed for other flus or pandemic viruses or diseases had to be changed because of how contagious COVID is. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, and let's see. Do you recommend keeping the core team in place throughout COVID-19, or would it be better to rotate people on and off?
This is Ben. I think keeping the core team in place, if you change it too much, you're going to lose some synergy. So as I move from yellow to green, or I move from reopening to recovery, if I have a whole new team, the new team may not be completely aware of what the previous team did. So I think having some of the key members remain from a continuity standpoint is going to be an important piece, especially as if we transition to from reopening to recovery. And then, you know, heaven forbid, we have another outbreak, you know, in October, November, or December, and we have to go back to the reopening phase. If you have a bunch of different members that weren't familiar with what it looked like back, you know, what we've experienced in June and July and now, and they were only present for, you know, the recovery aspect, they may not be as well prepared to help the organization go back through the reopening phase. So I think having some continuity on there is a very important piece. But, you know, as we transition from reopening to recovery, we may find that we have more of a need for some, you know, business members or staff members than what we did during the reopening phase. So, you know, we're in recovery now. So, you know, we're full bore on a different aspect of our business. So we may have had some participants that really, I'm not going to say their services are no longer needed, but they're probably not as key as what, you know, we need to bring some other folks to address the recovery aspect. So, you know, Dave, anything you want to add?
No, not at all. That's appropriate and correct. Now, if you're dealing with long-term planning teams, there will be a certain amount of rotating out. But for your current, you know, the existing COVID team, unless there's a problem or something happens, don't mess with the team composition.
Let's see. Are there any other questions from participants that you'd like to post on the Q&A board? And I'll give people a minute to do that. And I just wanted to say that in my company, we talk about during these times, adapt, innovate, and communicate, which is pretty much what you're saying here as well. Because if people aren't willing to adapt, then the world's going to adapt around you, and you will maybe not be able to successfully maintain your business. So I think that example that you gave about the restaurants all turning into takeout places, using their food trucks, going out into neighborhoods, meeting the people where they are, I think those are the ways people are going to stay viable. I don't see any more questions coming in. Do you, Dave, or you, Ben, have any last thoughts that you'd like to share, or things that maybe you didn't touch on but now think maybe you could add?
Nothing comes to my mind without turning into another hour's worth of discussion.
Which I'm sure it could become. Yes, I get it. How about you, Ben?
Benita, I was going to just say thanks for, you know, highlighting the, you know, the adapting aspect, because I think, I use two other examples is, there are several hospitals, we've seen, elective surgeries, perhaps be postponed for the interim due to the COVID response, which has created, a significant drain on some of those, different aspects of the hospital, which have traditionally supported elective surgeries, but are not involved in the pandemic response. And I even use perhaps a simpler example is, I got my my bike tuned up for the spring, and I picked it up in March, and the bike shop was completely full of bikes. And I went back because I had an issue with it a few weeks ago. And, when I was there in March, the inventory was over 300 bikes, and good for the bike shop. When I went in last week, there were 2 bikes on the floor. And so I said, wow, great sales. He goes, yeah, I've sold more in these 3 months than I've sold in the previous 2 years. But the unfortunate reality is I can't get more inventory. And so, he was explaining to me as he went and he's had to make the transition from selling bikes to now emphasizing that, his bike repair capabilities, just due to the pandemic and the fact that the supply chain can't support the sales anymore. So the good news is a lot of Americans have taken to outdoor activities that don't require a lot of concerns about social distancing. But, the flip side of that is some businesses have really had some challenges with that. But no, thank you, Benita.
Thank you both. That was very informative. I appreciate your time. We will make the recording available to everybody, not only those who are on this call today, but to public. We'll push it out via social media and on your website as well. So it'll be available for everyone to watch. Thank you all again. Have a great day.